Hello and welcome to Book Bites. This week it is just Jason and I. We are going over 7 languages in 7 weeks. This week we're going to talk about Ruby and maybe a little introduction to the book as well.
Yeah.
So this is one that I've wanted to do since we started the podcast. I think you might have mentioned it, or maybe I did. I don't know. But this book has always intrigued me.
I think I've mentioned it in Discord probably every time that we've had a gap of let's do this, because we have a topic every week that is time bound and well defined as to what to look at. So glad we're finally starting it.
Okay. Do you have anything to add from the introduction that you'd like to talk about?
I guess I did like some of the things called out in the introduction, like how the language choice was done, because there are so many languages, and I specifically liked that IO was called out because it is a prototypal language. We'll get into it more next time after I do some studying of it, but it was brought up that was chosen over JavaScript, even though JavaScript is also a prototypal language, but they chose it just because it was something that was different and not familiar to everyone. Just so you do have to take a change in perspective. And that's kind of my reason for even wanting to look at the book, is putting me in a place where I'm working with languages that I have less familiarity with.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that he wanted to pick out different languages that explore all sorts of different programming models. So he wanted languages with different typing models, different programming models, how you interact with it. Is it compiled or interpreted? Does it have an interactive shell? Different design constructs and core data structures. And then just languages that have unique features. But it's not going to be able to teach you all 7 languages in one book. It's going to skip over some of the basics, and it's going to dive deep into certain areas and not into certain areas. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. Something to at least spur your interest in taking a look at a language, and have you in the mindset of the way that you do things is not necessarily always going to be the way that we do things as an industry, because he brings up the paradigm shift in the industry of things like the big movement towards object-oriented programming. And I was definitely not around when that transition happened. But you can even see it today where there's such a big push on the functional front of things, and how, I don't know, just things that we know and like we kind of rely on could get flipped on us pretty quick in the industry. And so having awareness of what's out there is a good thing to have.
And I always think learning a new language is uncomfortable. It can be fun. The beginning stages are fun. And I think in this book, we're going to see a lot of the beginning stages that are fun. But once you get past that initial step of starting to learn a language and you really try to become fluent in it, it's uncomfortable. And I want to be continually learning new languages and not just be good at a certain language, but be good at learning languages.
And with that too, you definitely have to be willing to set down the things that you know and are comfortable with in the language that you use most regularly, to say, no, this is a different paradigm, and not everything has to work like what I know.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure there's so many examples of JavaScript written like a Ruby developer, or C# written like a JavaScript developer, or like whatever it is, Python written like a Ruby, like, I don't know. You take your way of writing code and you want to bring it to the new language, and the language is not necessarily supposed to be that way. It's Python code supposed to be Python-y, and Ruby code supposed to be Ruby-y, JavaScript-y for JavaScript. But one of the things it does mention in the intro is that, hey, maybe there's something that you learn in a certain language and you can take some of those ideas to a different language.
Definitely. I would agree with that. Having been exposed to different languages in the past, they all have one level of influence or another in in the way that I write today. So there's definitely influence, and there can be some crossover, but it is also sometimes obvious when a language comes from, or when a developer comes from a specific background and moves to another language. Sometimes, like I know at work we have people who came from doing back-end Java development. When they get into the JavaScript world, they are strongly inclined to write lots of classes because that is the model that they're very familiar with. Whereas other people won't write a class unless they absolutely have to for something. So,
okay, well, let's move on to Ruby then. Oh, wait, sorry. I should mention the languages that are in this book.
Yeah.
So there's Ruby, IO, Prolog, Scala, Erlang, Clojure, and Haskell. And so looking at this list, I was like, I'm not familiar with anything except for Ruby. That's pretty popular. I've also heard Scala is pretty cool. And I've heard of Clojure and Haskell. Clojure. I don't even know how to pronounce it in Haskell. But the two that really stuck out for me was IO, I'd never heard of, and Prolog. Maybe I've heard of that.
For me, I have actual production experience in Ruby. That's the one that I'm most familiar with. I had never heard of IO. Prolog always seemed very out there, and I've never spent any time with it. Scala I've tinkered with. Clojure I've tinkered with, and Haskell I've tinkered with.
Okay.
And I think that's all of them. Maybe I missed one. But yeah, Ruby definitely is the most familiar one for me. Ruby is a very dynamically typed language. I guess in order to describe dynamically typed, I'm probably going to botch it and get it opposite of where it is. But the types of things are so the types of things aren't checked until runtime. I mean, it is strong in that it won't do coercion for you. Like if you try and add something like a string and a number, the computer will yell at you, cannot compute, unless you teach it, which, I mean, inevitably somebody has made Ruby more capable of handling weird cases like that, because the flip side of Ruby is that it is very open and extensible. So if you want to make big changes to the language in the way that it works, because it's objects all the way down and classes are open, you can extend anywhere. And I like that within the book, it refers to that as a sharp scalpel.
Yeah. It gives you the rope to hang yourself with.
Yeah. So my, I guess, experience on it, I actually wrote Ruby for about 4 years, about 4 years ago.
Wow.
So it's been a little while since I actually have written any Ruby, but I was doing primarily web dev, but I was not doing Rails. I was a Rails holdout. It never quite worked the way that I wanted it to, or I never got comfortable with that. So I actually used Sinatra and SQL rather than Rails and Active Record for doing things. But did that, and I definitely think that it held up well for doing the product we were doing. Like we didn't have like major performance considerations with what we were working on, and instead, kind of like the book talks about, that time to market was a big factor in that, and just getting something put together because it was a small, scrappy startup, and it worked excellent for that, for building something out and then iterating on it quickly.
Yeah. So
what about you, Adam?
I have a little bit of production experience with Ruby. About a year ago, I was a contractor at a place that used Ruby on Rails, and I was supposed to do JavaScript, but I ended up doing a little bit of Ruby on Rails for a few weeks. And then the only other one I have some experience with is Scala. About 7 years ago, I went through a little bit of a course on Scala. I think it was on Coursera, and it was taught by the creator of Scala. But then it was just,
the Martin
it was very
Nordrosky
difficult
course.
for me at the time. And I thought it was very interesting. I was just not ready for the functional programming paradigm. So yeah, I mean, I have a little production experience with Ruby, but I never really sat down and learned the syntax.
That's interesting. Having just had you jump kind of straight into it. I guess that could be the contract world, right?
Yeah, and I was doing some pair programming, trying to just jumping in the deep end and trying to keep my head above water, but it was difficult.
What would you say was the most difficult thing when approaching it?
Well, the code base itself was pretty big, and so I wouldn't know where to go for certain things. There were views. There were views that were written in like all sorts of different types of languages. So I think there were some views written in YAML, but then I think there was another one that was similar to YAML, but not quite. So it wasn't exactly HTML. And then there were just like files, different files connected, and you kind of had to follow the path, but there was no like explicit imports. So I think Ruby does some sort of file resolution thing where it's going to look in the current folder, and if it doesn't find it there, then it looks in the parent, and then if it doesn't find it there, and then like I think Rails adds some stuff on top of that where it looks in certain common places for certain types of files for routes and views and things, and I just didn't know where anything was because I didn't know any of the conventions.
Yeah, I know that was a real key part of the Rails learning process that I didn't spend a ton of time or get super familiar with. I know that it was very big on organizing things like your models, your views, and your controllers, because Rails was huge on the MVC realm. And I also believe that one of the things that Rails had was it used Bundler, which was the Ruby package manager. I guess Ruby Gems is the underlying thing, but Bundler is what everybody uses in order to do it, because Gems was just like a global install type of thing, and Bundler actually lets you create a file that listed out your dependencies. And one feature that Bundler had was the ability to go and require all of your gems in right at the start of the application, which was nice or convenient for not having to go and require everything. And so like all your dependencies would just be loaded and available. And because Ruby just works with like a global namespace where like at the base of it all, there is the kernel object that has everything on it. Like when you go and like you can go and define stuff on there, and I mean, hope that your things don't conflict with each other, but it is true. Like not having explicit imports, that was probably the thing that challenged me most sometimes with Ruby when it came to debugging, was figuring out where does a specific behavior come from.
We'll get into it more later, but you can do meta programming with Ruby, and so you may literally not be able to find the place where the code is being run by searching around in your code.
Because it may not exist as a named
may not
method
be a named
or something.
Method. It's like generated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, day one, it talked a lot about just going and getting set up in.
Oh, yeah. So I thought I was way behind going through this first week because I had like 3 days left, and I was like, I haven't started. And then it turns out there's only 3 days.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, I mean, there's definitely take home work or do it yourself work. Like the commitment on that front, like 3 days, I think is not enough to learn the language, but to get exposure for sure.
And I mean, it's 34 pages, so you're doing like 10 pages a day. It's pretty nice. And then the exercises. So total, I spent 2 hours and 45 minutes reading and 2 hours and 45 minutes doing the exercises. So it's not bad. Like I thought it was going to be a huge commitment to go through an entire week of one language and an entire week of another language. But yeah, so day one, you kind of get set up and learn some basics. Like, hey, arithmetic
Yeah.
works as you would expect. But then there's other things like you can do dot methods on anything and find out what methods you can call on it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely a useful thing when going and debugging something or inspecting it to see like what can you do or what can you do with it.
I also thought it was really cool that single quotes versus double quotes are different. The double quoted string gets evaluated so you can have string interpolation. But then I noticed with examples throughout the book, sometimes they'll just use double quoted, even though they don't need it to be evaluated. So I'm not sure what the convention is.
I don't know for sure. I think back in the day, I used to be harder on it of being consistent on use single quotes if I'm not interpolating and then use double if I am. But I think they did some measuring on it. I remember like looking at old blog posts that said it really didn't matter. And so there's not necessarily performance overhead that you're going to bump into. So maybe you could just go with double unless you need them. I don't know. On like a hard set of rules, and it doesn't seem like they stuck to it either. I mean, maybe that's just the Rubyism of like just express how you feel, and Ruby will do the rest. Like you aren't worried about top-notch performance, but instead having a good developer experience.
Yeah, so that's the other thing it talks about is how Ruby, it compares it to Mary Poppins. It says, first off, Mary Poppins is a great nanny, but secondly, she's fun. And Ruby is supposed to be able to get things done, but be really fun and put the focus on developer happiness and productivity. And I learned about this concept that Ruby on Rails is supposed to be fun several years ago. Let's see, 5-6 years ago. And I thought I would end up being a Ruby on Rails developer because that sounded really cool. And it didn't turn out that way. But if I had gone to the back end, I definitely would have wanted to use Ruby.
That was something that actually brought me into Ruby. Was before I started a job with it, I had started going to Ruby meetups for quite a while and just seeing how passionate and excited people were about writing Ruby code. Like I don't know if I've been part of groups that are quite that thrilled. I mean, don't get me wrong, like there are definitely groups that are making amazing things, but there was so much like Ruby love related stuff. Like it was all hearts and kittens, and we're so glad to be writing Ruby stuff that it was just really a feel good community to be part of. So I think that the language and the community definitely like came together on that front.
So you were talking about dynamic typing. It also mentions that it uses duck typing, which is it.
Yeah. So there's no like hard interfaces that exist. So when you go and define a method, you don't say what it is that's getting passed in. It's just based on usage of whether or not the thing works. So if you have a method that I don't know is called
2s, like two string.
Yeah, 2s. Sure. Yeah, if it's got 2s on it, like it will call it on whatever it is and not really care on what the underlying type is.
So you could have an array of lots of different types within that array and then map over it and call 2s on everything in it. And as long as each of those objects has their own 2s method, it'll work. So yeah, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
I definitely like some of the things within it too that they give for convenience of, like, say you wanted to go and perform something 10 times, being able to literally write 10 dot times and then pass it a block of what you want it to do. That is really nice versus a for loop, or I mean, there, like, to go and do, say, like the equivalent in JavaScript is not nearly as nice. I mean, you can kind of hack it by creating a new array of size 10 and then filling it and then mapping over it, but that's way worse than 10 dot times. So
Yeah, and then after 10 dot times, you can just have a block. So a block is not really a thing I was familiar with. That is just a piece of code. It's not a function. It's just a piece of code, and you can pass it around, or you can use it in different ways. So if you do 10 dot times, you have a block of code. You're just saying do this block of code this many times.
right, yeah. There are let's see, there are blocks and procs and lambdas. I haven't spent enough time or looking at it in a while.
Blocks and procs and lambdas.
Yes.
Oh my.
Oh my. Yes. And I think what a major difference is a lambda is very much like a function that can get passed around, and you kind of write it the same way. I mean, you write it the same way. You can even write the word lambda like that. It's a keyword within Ruby. But a block is special in that it can like force the outside to return, like if that makes sense. So if you're doing 10 dot times and you're iterating over that, if you were to go and do a return there, then you can go and make the outer function return, if that makes sense.
So then times that actually return something.
So not the times itself, but so if you had a function that was called do something 10 times, and you did 10 dot times, and inside the block you returned on the 5th iteration for some reason, then you can return from that block, and it causes the outer function to return.
Wow. So it would actually break out of anything after that point in the function.
Yeah.
And
so that's kind of the distinguishing part, if I remember right. And maybe we'll have to go and add some errata later where I was wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that's part of it, because otherwise, if you needed to do like early return, then you would have to go back to a more traditional for loop or something.
Yeah, and blocks are just surrounded with quotes or curly braces. Unless you want maybe multiple lines, you can start off with do and end. And I must still have some Vim plugin installed from my days of working on Ruby, because it auto completes the word end for me, and it actually feels really nice to type do and then hit enter, and then end is just there. Or if you're doing a function, so day 2 gets into functions, and you do def and the name of the function, hit enter, and it puts the word end on the end. And I really didn't think I would like that, using words instead of curly braces, but it's not bad at all.
Yeah, you definitely adjust to it. It also spares you sometimes the ambiguous syntax that you can wind up with using the curly braces. Yeah,
because curly braces can be used for so many things.
Yeah, they can, because they can be used for blocks, but then this is something that I think I bumped into, was passing a hash in, the hash being just like a key value lookup. Passing that in, the literal syntax is using the squiggly brackets or curly braces, and it was taking that as a block.
Interesting. I didn't have that problem with that challenge.
Yeah. If you try and pass it in, unless you use parentheses around it.
Oh, yeah. So that's the other thing. So in Ruby, the parentheses are optional a lot of times. Right. If you're invoking a function, you just have the name, space, and what you're passing in. But what you're saying is since the hash that you were trying to pass in is surrounded in curly braces, you had to use parentheses? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't have that problem because I wasn't thinking like a Ruby developer and leaving off parentheses.
Yeah, it's kind of nice in that it cuts down on some of the syntax.
Yeah.
And I remember that being a nice part of being able to write tests, is that you could avoid a lot of curly braces in cases. And so, I don't know, you can write more like just human readable stuff. Even just things like puts, like putting that in front of stuff. Like if you want to do it to see it and not having to go and wrap things. So there's some nice convenience there, but occasionally you can bump into the syntax.
Yeah, so I noticed that puts will print out stuff to the screen with a new line.
Yeah.
And if you don't want the new line, you can use print. So in day 2, it also says arrays are Ruby's workhorse ordered collection. And so you can do lots of interesting things with them. You can do a negative index to count from the end. And then it has methods like push and pop.
Yeah. So you can use their arrays like a number of different data sources. So you can, if you're doing push and pop, then you get stack like behavior, and you can, and there's also the shovel operator as well.
Shovel.
Yes. So that is less than.
Oh, okay. I saw this in one of the examples, I think, and I wasn't sure what that was.
Yes. So that is to go and put something into it.
Oh, okay. Nice. I thought it was some sort of assignment operator.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess it doesn't assign it, just modifies it. And it's also, like, it's something that you can do to arrays. It's also something that you can do to strings as well, because strings in Ruby...
Oh, does it do a concatenation?
Well, it actually modifies a string. So a string in Ruby is actually mutable. So, you can tell it to freeze. Like, I think it's just string.freezed in order to go and freeze one.
Huh.
But strings in Ruby are mutable. So rather than having to bust out some sort of string builder or pushing a whole bunch of things into an array and calling join or something like that, in Ruby's case, a string is a mutable thing.
Yeah. What else I thought was cool is ranges. So you can do square brackets and some number ... another number. And you can actually like access an array using a range. So you can do animals and then say 0.1, and then you'll get the first and second. You'll get a new array with the first and second item. First through second item, I should say.
Right. Yeah. If you want it to be exclusive and not include that upper bound, you can use 3 dots.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There was something that I had to pull out of memory as well. So 2 dots inclusive, 3 dots exclusive, because they had one.
That's incredibly concise.
Yeah.
And I can imagine it tripping me up because it's just an extra dot.
Right.
And then you have an off by 1 error because of a dot. Like, why do an extra dot when you could just make the second number 1 less? But I could see why, if the second number is a variable, you don't want to subtract 1 from the variable, just add an extra dot. I could see it.
Yeah. I don't know why I opted for it. There was the one exercise where it had said handles contents of 16 numbers. I think that was it. So it wanted you to slice an array of 16 numbers into 4 slices of 4 numbers, and with that I wound up making a range of 0 to 16, and then sliced that in chunks of 4, or did each slice with 4 chunks. And so like the 0 to 16, I don't know, it just made sense versus making 0 to 15. Like,
yeah, I probably took too much code to do that one. I did array.each, and then inside of there I did a modulus on 4. And so if I modulus 4 is 0, then I would use a puts, and else I would use a print, because it just wanted you to print out 4 on the same line and then print out the next 4 on the next line. Yeah. So basically just keep printing it. When you get to the 4th one, do a puts. So you have a new line.
Interesting. That's something I actually want to see afterwards, Adam, is what your code looks like and compare it to my exercises just to see.
Yeah. And some of them for day 1, I did it one way. And then after reading more, I rewrote it a different way. Like I would say in day 2, I learned you can actually do it this way, which is a lot better.
Do you have a specific example?
Yeah, just the first one. Well, the third one on day 1 says print your name 10 times. And so the first time I just did a while loop.
Yeah.
And then after I went through day 2, I did 3 dot times.
Oh, yeah.
And the blocks just says puts at them. So that's just a simple example.
Nice.
But there's another one where you needed to print the string, this is sentence number 1, and then change it where it's this is sentence number 2, number 3, all the way to 10. The first time I used a while loop. And then the second time I did a range from 1 to 10 dot step 1. And then I did a block with puts. And then I'm using string interpolation to just change the number on the end.
Nice. Yeah.
So learning about ranges and step, that helps. Step is really interesting though, because you tell it like what you want to count by.
I guess I hadn't even thought about using a step. But
what did you do on that one? What did you do on this is sentence number 1 through 10?
So for the just doing the range, so I did a 1 to 10, like a range of 1 to 10, and I called dot each on it.
Oh, dot each.
And then
that's probably better because I'm going by one. So you don't really need step 1. But yeah, I think that's part of Ruby is there's so many ways to do it. Like whatever makes sense to you, you should be able to do it that way. Even down to when you go into the Ruby REPL, which is like an interactive way to work with it. REPL is like read, evaluate, print, and loop. So you can type in some code, see what it evaluates to, and type some more code and see it. But when you're in there, you can get out of it either with quit or exit. And they could have just picked one. And when you tried to use the other one, just, hey, unknown error, or it might have said, hey, did you mean exit? But instead, they're like, it's fine. Whatever you want to use, we know what you mean. So we're going to give you multiple options.
That makes me think of a Ruby gem that used to exist, or probably still exist. It's basically like, did you mean? And it goes and it abuses method missing to the extreme, to where every object is extended to if you call a method on it and it happens to be close, then like if it happens to be close text wise, then or like within a certain Hamming distance, then it'll say you probably meant this, and it'll just call it. So
it'll just call it silently.
So yeah, so it was definitely like a joke gem.
Oh,
but
I mean,
if you think about like
if it
socket.receive or something,
if it like threw an error that gave you some helpful information, I would probably use that. But
yeah, but to just flat out go and call it, it definitely a joke package. But I mean, you do think about it though, like socket.receive. I can't tell you the number of times that I've written the word receive for some method or function and botched spelling receive.
The E and the I. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it is powerful enough that it could just work because it's close enough.
Yeah. I don't like it though. You know,
No.
like you're searching through your code base for receive and you're not going to find it because it's misspelled, but it still works.
It's true.
Yeah. So then it talks about hashes, which is pretty interesting. Kind of like an array, but you can give it a key value pair. It also talks about using symbols, which are kind of like strings, but you just do, instead of surrounding with quotes, you do a colon in some characters. And that was really cool because then it talks about how, like, when you use a symbol, it's always the same symbol. When you use a string with the same characters, it's not the same string. And it, in fact, has an ID that you can see. So you can do .object ID and see this. It has a different ID for different strings. But if you do the same thing on a symbol, you'll get the exact same ID.
Yeah.
And that was just interesting to me that it exposes an ID for objects. And I was curious if that gets used in production code or if that's...
Checking the object ID?
Yeah.
I don't know a specific case offhand, but like if you want to assert that two things are exactly the same thing, and
Yeah.
that they're not just equal, but
Yeah.
the actual same reference object ID would get you that.
Yeah. So I guess it might be used under the hood for some assertion libraries.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess knowing that strings are mutable also makes more sense of why symbols exist, because symbols are not mutable.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it talks about how Ruby does not have named parameters, but then you can use symbols as a way of emulating named parameters by just like pass in an object hash, and then inside the function you can access object, and then the key that you try to access is some symbol.
So that is actually something that has changed in Ruby since the book was written.
Oh, really?
Yes. So there are keyword arguments.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah, I noticed it's using like 1.9 or something, and I was on 2 point something.
Yeah. I know for a long time, Ruby 187 was the long-lived version, because Ruby 1.9 made some big changes, but also came with some big performance improvements. And then in later versions of Ruby 2, they added things like keyword arguments. So they also added, I think in Ruby they added a new syntax for lambda that was like an arrow with parentheses. Like it was
okay.
Like rather than writing out the word lambda, you got to be way more symbol heavy. And yeah, so they do have that now.
Was it like a dash and a greater than, or like an equals and a greater than?
Yes. So like a dash and then a greater than, and then parentheses for your arguments, and then curly braces for your block.
Okay.
Yeah. Super terse over writing out lambda.
Cool.
Did you take on the tree exercise?
Yeah, I did. That was that day 2?
Oh, I guess there were two day 2 things. So, but one of them was making a tree that took like a hash and converted it to a tree.
Yeah, I did that. So it gave us some code that was a tree, but the way that you had to construct the tree was to pass in the name and the children. So if you wanted a tree that was more than just one thing with some children, that your second argument had to be an array of more trees that you were creating. And so it was super verbose, and the challenge was we should just be able to pass it in with a clean interface where you just type out a hash of the whole tree. And it was a little bit challenging, but actually easier than I thought. What about you?
Yeah, I took it on, and like any time that you have the word tree brought up, it's time to bring out recursion, right?
Right. Yep.
So
and actually, I don't know if you did this, but in my implementation, I allow you to use either syntax. So you can pass in the name and an array of trees you create yourself, or you can pass in a hash.
Nice. I made a separate function on the tree class, like a static function that was called build. So you could do tree.build and give it a hash.
Okay. Yeah.
So instead of overloading the constructor.
Yep. Yeah, I just overloaded the constructor, which is the constructor always called initialize in Ruby?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so when you pass in name to initialize, I check if name.instance of, and I actually really love this in Ruby. If the method is returning a Boolean, the convention is the name ends in a question mark. So instance of hash. And so I find out if it's a hash, then I pass it to a different function to create it.
Mm-hmm. That definitely seems like a more Rubyism. Just thinking on it now, or are you describing that?
Yeah.
Because it's more of a give me what you want and I'll figure out what to do with it. Like if you give me something reasonable, I'll work with it. So nice. And then it also asked about doing a grep. And so I also took on that. because at the end of day 2, it says
that one was a lot
go
shorter
and
than
write
the
a
tree.
grep that will read in a file and go and find lines that match the pattern. Yeah, that was really short. I think it was about 10 lines. I guess I have a few spacing things and like, well, it was 10 lines because I have error handling. If you don't give a pattern to the command, then it gives you that.
I actually forgot to let you choose your own pattern. I've got a pattern hard coded in my code.
Yeah, that's the starting point.
Because I intended to pass it in from the command line, and I didn't yet figure out how to get a command line argument.
So in order to do that, there is a constant that's available.
argv.
Argv, and then that is an array of all of your arguments. And so
okay, yeah. So I thought I did this, but I guess not.
So doing argv sub 0 was what I took and used that pattern.
And then can you just surround argv 0 with slashes to make it a regex?
I actually just did line dot match a pattern. So you can pass it to the regex constructor.
Okay.
I think you can do interpolation in a regex. I'd have to see that, but that's right. I didn't actually make it a regex, so even my implementation fell short. But
okay.
I believe, so you cannot actually do interpolation inside of regex. So if you did slashes and then the interpolation syntax, then yes, you could do that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. In day 2, it also talks about mix-ins, which is a pattern I'm not familiar with. I've heard about them in Sass, I think, which is a CSS preprocessor.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was interesting. Instead of inheriting behaviors, you can just include. I'm going to do a terrible job of explaining this. You can just include a mixin, which is a module, and then that mixin may actually call functions from your class. So in order to use a mixin, you may have to implement certain functions. So it kind of reminds me of an interface. Like, I want to use this interface. Okay, in order to use this interface, you have to make certain methods. But I think with Ruby, it's not necessarily going to warn you or give you an error if you don't do that.
I wouldn't think so. I would expect it to fail if you tried later. Like if if you go and a really common one is the enumerable module, going and including that. So if you go and implement each, then you get all of those things that array has, or at least a lot of them, where you can go and call map and filter and all the other.
Oh, that's
things
another
that
one.
Enumerable provides. Yeah.
They have map, but they also have collect, which is the same thing with a different name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have. They had all of the ECT methods for
what's ECT
consistency. So like they had collect and they had select if you wanted to filter out to a list of things.
Oh, where does it end in ECT?
And they had reject. And yeah, I don't know if there were more of them, but I knew that they had two of them.
Cool.
Or like two forms of a number of them. So depending on where you're coming from.
Okay.
I know one that would always catch me is that there was find if you wanted to find a single item in a list. And then there was also first that was allowed or that existed. And first is to get the first thing out of a list or out of an enumerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But something that is easy to screw up is you can call, say you have an array, you said array.first, and then you gave it a block of some conditional. The block can get passed to any method, even if the method doesn't ask for it. And then it would just get flat out ignored. So I would go and call like array.first and say, I want to match the whatever item has the name of Alice. And it would always just give back the first item and ignore the block entirely because the correct thing was find.
Okay.
But you could always pass a block to whatever because Ruby doesn't care.
Yeah. Okay. So did you do the serious challenge on day 3?
The serious challenge on day 3? Yeah, I did go and take it on.
So it involves doing metaprogramming. And when I first heard about metaprogramming, I totally misunderstood it because it says metaprogramming means writing programs that write programs.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like something completely different. It sounds like the program is going to create a text file and write out some code, but that's not what it's doing. It's just while the code is running, there are like classes or methods available. Let's just say methods. There are methods available that are not written in your code, but you can call them in their work. And I love the example of Roman numerals.
Yeah, I like that one.
Because I've done Roman numeral stuff before, converting from numbers to Roman numerals and so forth. And all they do is make a class called Roman that defines method missing. And so then you can just call Roman.iv. And iv is not a method on Roman, but hey, it has a method missing, and it can take the name of the method that you tried to use and figure out what to do with it and return a number. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it definitely it is cool. It's something you obviously have to be careful with, but it can make for some really nice looking domain specific languages or DSLs.
Yeah. So the challenge was to take this Access CSV module and and then like create a new method on it called each that returns a row,
Mm-hmm.
and that row will let you call the name of the field that you want to get. So even though in your code you don't know what fields are going to be in the CSV file, you can then do, like, if you've got a CSV full of cities, you can do like row dot name, and it will grab the name of that city on that row.
Yeah, or row.state or row.zip code.
Yeah.
I mean, I know rows can have more than one, but yeah, you can write it in really handy syntax like that.
Yeah. So I've got a line here at the bottom of my challenge that says something.each, and it's got a block, and then it just puts, hey, row.city is in row.country with a population of row.population.
Yeah. I did that same thing as well. I mean, I guess I stuck with their kind of 1 and 2 example of lions and tigers, and I've got bears and sheep.
Okay. I thought the example was a little weird because the headers in the CSV file were just 1 and 2, which doesn't explain what kind of data is supposed to be in
that's
file.
CSVs for you.
And obviously, when it comes to CSVs, there's a lot of more edge cases that this example code doesn't cover. With if you have a comma inside of your data, you need to surround it with quotes. Mm-hmm. But that's fine.
Yeah, it's a really loose.
It's very
CSV
loose, and also like it's looking for comma and a space, but you don't have to have the space after the comma.
That gave me issues initially.
Yeah,
because my data set didn't have those.
Same.
Yeah, so I feel for you on that front, but yeah, I thought it was an interesting pattern that they opted to bring up, because it's definitely something common in Ruby to have a module that defines self.included, which is a hook to say, like, if this module gets included into another module or another class, then go and invoke this code.
Wow.
And so yeah, it's a method on it on a method on the module. And in their particular case, they actually call .extend, which extend is a method on a class that's called, and so they use base, which is what the module's getting included on. And so yeah, base.extend, and then they apply class methods to the thing, which then includes another module called instance methods.
Yeah.
If the function acts as CSV is called, which it seems like a whole lot to do what they're doing right here. And I know that they're just trying to give like a small example because you don't necessarily like, they don't want to go give like a full blown application. But where this actually does play out in is something like Rails. It's pretty common to have. They have a base class that a lot of stuff inherits from. Like all your models inherit from. It's like Rails model. I don't know. It's all like active model under the hood, but there's this one base class that all of your models inside of Rails extend. They actually do extend it, like, and then inside of your specific modules, you can go and say like person has many cars or something, and you can inside your class just put has many cars, and because you go and put that there, the metaprogramming goes and metaprogramming being like methods get defined named like dot cars that you can call on an instance. So then if you have a person model in your that you've pulled out of your database, you can call person.cars, and that will go and do a SQL query and give you back a list of cars, and all of that exists because you put that one has many cars as part of your class.
Yeah. Is that what it called active record?
So yeah, I mean, active record uses active model under the hood, which active model is like a generic model thing that you can tie it to anything. Like if you wanted to put it attached to another database, but active record was specific to working with SQL databases, which is what Rails used.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is the kind of thing, this metaprogramming stuff is what people would call magic.
Yes.
And they wouldn't like it because you don't know what's happening. If you take the time to understand Ruby and take the time to understand Rails or whatever it is that you're using, it can be really fun. And I guess you don't necessarily have to know all the stuff that's happening under the hood, although it's probably good if you can understand what's going on under the hood. But I remember pair programming with people on Ruby on Rails, and there were some weird things happening in test files. There was some weird syntax, and I would ask them, what is the syntax? How does this work? And they couldn't explain it to me. They said, that's kind of how this testing framework works. This is just how you write it. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to know, what is the syntax? What is happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely have to move toward a convention, like trusting in the convention in some regard. It's not that you throw away like all your understanding of programming, because that's not the case, because sometimes you have to roll up your sleeves and see what's going on.
Yeah.
But embrace the fact that there may be a lot going on under the hood. I mean, that was definitely something that Active Record did and still does, is things like it will, at the start of your Rails application, go and query your database to find a table that matched the name of that class that was potentially pluralized. So if your table, like if your class was named person, it would actually go and pluralize it to people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You really have to trust that it knows how to pluralize. Right.
And I mean, there are ways of breaking out of it, but all that would happen. And then the nice thing though is you're not writing all of that boilerplate inside of your code. Like you're focusing on, like, I have a person model that happens to exist against a people table in the database, and I know that it'll do that conventionally because it can pluralize. Yeah. And then I focus on writing things like this person has cars, and it knows that means that it has a car ID, or sorry, the car has a car ID or person ID column in there, and it can query against that. Like there's a lot of convention.
Yeah, sounds like you can really focus on the business logic that way instead of
instead of doing all the setup
and hooking things up.
Right. And I mean, it's for better or worse, but I mean that's part of it though, is you shouldn't have to concern yourself with all of that stuff, and I mean, that's kind of what it talks about even at the end of the chapter, is talking about time to market, is being able to get stuff out there and not worrying about all of the setup related things. I mean, I know that that's definitely something that is beneficial in a number of cases, is allowing the developer to just get started making something rather than spending the time doing setup. In the JavaScript realm, I know that people will struggle with like setting up a Webpack build, and it sounds like this monstrous burden, which, I mean, it can be daunting, especially if you haven't done it before. And so like having kind of the things like in JavaScript, it's like create React app. In Ruby, I mean, Rails new was huge, because I mean, you would do that and then you'd have a working application that could talk to a database, and you could go and with Rails 2, it also was big on like generating stuff out. So you could say, Rails, go generate me or scaffold me a view, a controller, and a model that can write to a table in the database. And while it was crude and didn't necessarily cover like all your validation cases and stuff, like you could really churn stuff out quickly. And as long as you adhere to those conventions, like your code was far more focused on your application's business logic than going and wiring stuff together.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. I've really enjoyed this peek into Ruby and enjoyed it a lot more than my time trying to write production code without understanding Ruby at all.
Yeah. And I've enjoyed going and taking a look back at it, because it is definitely refreshing to write after having stepped away from it for a while. And I will probably tinker with it just a little bit more, because I have some stuff in mind that I want to do. But beyond that, I am looking forward to diving into I/O next time, because that is something I haven't touched at all.
Yeah, and apparently I/O is like Ferris Bueller, so that sounds pretty fun.
Yeah, that could make for an exciting language to play with. So,
all right, you can follow me on Twitter at Agarhar. And what are you on Twitter?
Staten Jason.
And you can follow the show at BookBytes FM, and get in touch with us. If you want to give us any feedback, you can leave a review on iTunes. You can reach out to us on Twitter, and we'd love to talk to you. All right, we'll see you next time.
See ya.